Dad's 72nd birthday started out exactly how I planned it. Balloons in the barn, tables lined with food, neighbors and old friends showing up early. I spent the morning making sure everything looked perfect. Dad had his good shirt on, the one I got him last Christmas. He looked happy, which was the point. I wanted him to forget about the hip pain and the slow recovery from that fall a few months back. I was determined to make it a day worth remembering. Then my sister Evelyn decided to make it her stage. She stood up in the middle of the barn, holding her wine glass like she was about to give the toast of the year. I should have known nothing good comes when she starts smiling like that. She tapped her glass, waited until the chatter died down, and then, loud enough for everyone to hear, she said, "Pack your bags, Julia. We're selling the farm." The room went silent for half a second, then erupted into polite claps and awkward smiles. A few of her friends from Richmond people Dad barely knew actually cheered. Dad froze in his chair. I could see he was confused. And me? I was holding a plate of cornbread, wondering if throwing it at her head would be considered assault. Evelyn kept going, talking about how this was for Dad's own good, how moving him to a care facility in Richmond was the responsible choice. She didn't even look at me, just kept selling her little speech like she was pitching a deal to a client. My jaw clenched so hard I thought I might crack a molar. I set the plate down, walked past the dessert table, and stepped outside. The air was cold, sharp. My boots crunched against the gravel as I pulled my phone from my pocket. I scrolled to one number, hit call, and put the phone to my ear. "Daniel, it's happening," I said when he picked up. "Right now. Just like we thought." "I'm on my way," he replied. That was all I needed to hear. 6 months earlier, none of this was on my radar. I was stationed at Fort Bragg, managing logistics for an upcoming deployment rotation. My days were filled with inventory reports, equipment inspections, and the occasional chewing out from a colonel who thought my team was too slow unloading pallets. It was routine, which in the Army is as close as you get to peace. Then I got the call. Dad had fallen in the barn, broken his hip. Evelyn said he was slipping mentally and couldn't be left alone. She didn't offer to take care of him herself, of course. She didn't just said someone needed to be there. She also made a point to mention how expensive the farm was to maintain, which should have been my first red flag. I put in for emergency family leave. Command approved it within the week. My CO even said, "Take care of your dad, Captain Merrick. We'll hold the line here." That's the Army for you. Family emergencies get handled. No questions asked, as long as the paperwork's tight. When I drove up the gravel road to the farm for the first time in years, the sight hit me harder than I expected. The white farmhouse, the big red barn, the oak tree Mom planted the year I was born. It was all there, like it had been waiting for me, but the place felt watched. There was a shiny black SUV parked by the gate. A man in a blazer was leaning against it, scrolling on his phone. Inside, Dad was in his recliner, leg propped up, television on low. He looked older, sure, but his eyes were clear. We talked about his recovery, how the physical therapist came twice a week, how Sophie from down the road still brought him casseroles. Then Evelyn walked in like she owned the place. She hugged Dad, glanced at me and said, "Oh, Julia, you're here." Like I'd just popped in from across town, not driven 6 hours from base. I asked about the man outside. She waved it off. "Just a friend. He's in real estate." End quote. That afternoon, I found a folder on the kitchen counter. Inside were glossy photos of the farm, like a brochure, price estimates, a draft contract. Before I could read more, Evelyn walked in and slid it off the counter. "Private paperwork," she said. I didn't argue, not then, but the Army teaches you to spot patterns, and I'd just seen the start of one. The next few weeks, I stayed busy. Morning coffee with Dad, driving him to appointments, making sure his meds were on track. But there were things that didn't fit. Evelyn showing up unannounced with friends to walk the property. Phone calls she took in the other room. And that same SUV parked near the gate more than once. I kept my mouth shut and my ears open. You learn that in uniform too. Sometimes it's better to let people think you're not paying attention, right up until you're ready to move. By the time the birthday rolled around, I had a pretty good idea what Evelyn was planning. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have guessed, was that she'd try to pull it off in front of a room full of people. And she did it with that perfect, calculated smile, the one that always made Mom say she should have been a politician. When I stepped outside and made that call to Daniel, I wasn't just asking for backup. I was putting the plan we'd quietly built into motion. And I knew once it started, there wasn't going to be any turning it off. I pushed open the barn door and stepped back inside, like nothing had happened. Dad was still at his table, smiling politely at the folks who came up to shake his hand. Evelyn was off in a corner, laughing with two men in blazers. I recognized one of them from the SUV. I kept my face neutral, the way you do in a briefing when you already know the answer but want to see who talks themselves into a corner. When I first came back to the farm after leaving Fort Bragg, I'd hoped for a few quiet weeks. The Army had been running me hard late nights with shipping manifests, last-minute gear checks, and 100 emails I didn't care about. Stepping onto the gravel drive that first day felt like walking into another life. But within minutes, it was clear this wasn't going to be a peaceful homecoming. Dad's handshake was strong when I arrived, but there was fatigue in his eyes. "It's good to see you, Jules," he'd said, a rare smile breaking through. We sat in the kitchen and I brewed coffee while he caught me up on his recovery. He made it sound like the fall was just bad luck, slipped on a wet spot in the barn, end of story. But when I asked about his medication, he hesitated, said Evelyn had handled it. Later that afternoon, I spotted Evelyn in the yard with a man in a polo shirt pointing at the north pasture. I stepped out onto the porch to say hello, and she introduced him as a friend who's curious about farming. He didn't look curious, he looked like he was calculating acreage. 2 days in, I was starting to map the patterns. Evelyn came by almost every day, never empty-handed. Sometimes she had baked goods for Dad, sometimes she had documents in a slim folder. She'd bring her husband Colin along, and he'd hang back while she chatted with Dad. Whenever I came into the room, she'd close the folder or switch the subject. One evening, I came back from running errands and found a car parked halfway down the drive. 2 people were inside, flipping through what looked like a property listing binder. They pulled away when I got closer. Inside the house, Dad was asleep in his chair, and there was a fresh pot of coffee on the counter Evelyn's doing. I didn't say a word about the car, but I wrote down the plate number. Dad and I fell into a routine. Morning coffee, feeding the chickens, short walks out to the barn. His balance was still shaky, but he lit up every time he got outside. He'd tell me stories about the farm, how my grandfather built the barn with lumber from a neighbor's sawmill, how Mom planted that oak by the driveway when she was pregnant with me. Those moments reminded me exactly why the place mattered. But there were cracks in the calm. Twice I caught Evelyn in Dad's office, the one he kept locked when I was a kid. She said she was tidying paperwork. The second time, I noticed the desk drawers weren't closed all the way, and the lock was turned the wrong direction. The day before the birthday party, a white SUV pulled up while I was fixing the fence on the east side. A woman in heels stepped out, looked around like she was checking square footage, and asked me if I was with the listing. I told her no, and she left without another word. That night, I went into Dad's study and checked the drawer where he kept old deeds and property maps. Half the maps were gone. In the Army, you learn to keep your cards close until you're ready to play them. I started taking notes, dates, times, who I saw on the property. I photographed documents when Evelyn left them out. I even called an old buddy in the county clerk's office to ask if any transfer paperwork had been filed. Nothing official yet, which told me Evelyn was still maneuvering. Dad didn't see it coming. He trusted her, and maybe part of him wanted to believe she had his best interests at heart. But I'd seen this kind of operation before, different setting, same tactic. Someone gets close, convinces the decision-maker they can't handle things alone, and then steps in for their own good. By the time the target realizes what's happening, the ink's already dry. That morning at the party, when she stood up and said those words in front of everyone, it confirmed everything I'd been piecing together. She'd chosen her moment carefully public enough to put me on the defensive, confident that Dad wouldn't cause a scene in front of guests. What she didn't know was that I'd already been setting my own pieces in place, and the call I made outside wasn't a spur-of-the-moment reaction. It was the signal to move. As I sat back down at Dad's table, I glanced toward the barn doors. The cold air from outside was still on my jacket, but my focus was locked in. Evelyn was still laughing with her friends, certain she was in control. She didn't notice me watching. She didn't need to, not yet. 2 days after the party, Evelyn pulled into the driveway with that clipped tone in her voice that meant she'd already decided how the day was going to go. Dad's got an appointment with Dr. Hales this afternoon, she said, grabbing her purse from the passenger seat. She needs to check his cognitive status for the paperwork. I didn't like the way she said paperwork. In the army, that word usually means something's about to land on your desk that you won't like but can't ignore. I told her I'd come along. She tried to wave me off, saying she'd handle it, but I made it clear I wasn't asking. We loaded Dad into her SUV and headed into town. The clinic was spotless in that way small-town offices are magazines a year old, a potted plant that might be fake, and a receptionist who greeted Evelyn like they were old friends. Which, apparently, they were. Dr. Karen Hales came out a few minutes later. Mid-52nd, sharp suit under her white coat, and the kind of smile that doesn't reach her eyes. She shook my hand politely, but focused on Evelyn. Dad followed her into the exam room, and I stayed close enough to hear. She started with small talk, asking Dad about the weather and how he was feeling. Then she slid into a series of questions that sounded simple but were easy to trip up on. What year is it? Who's the president? Can you count backward from 100 by sevens? Dad answered some quickly, hesitated on others. Hales made notes without giving away what she thought. Then she pivoted. Tom, have you been feeling confused lately? Forgetting things? He shook his head, but she kept pressing. Has anyone told you you might not be able to make decisions for yourself? Evelyn shifted in her chair and shot me a glance that said, Don't interfere. When the exam was over, Hales stepped into the hall with Evelyn. I stayed in the room with Dad, who was looking irritated. She's asking me like I'm already halfway gone, he muttered. Hales came back with a clipboard and a professional smile. Based on today's evaluation, I'm concerned about some cognitive decline. For your safety, Tom, I recommend assigning a power of attorney to someone you trust. Evelyn has agreed to take on that responsibility. I asked her what she was basing this on. She gave me a string of vague phrases. Mild impairment indicators, risk factors, best practices, but nothing concrete. When I mentioned his VA medical records, she brushed it off. Different systems, different metrics. Back at the farm, I helped Dad inside while Evelyn lingered in the driveway, talking on her phone. Once he was settled, I went to the kitchen to make coffee. That's when I noticed a new pill bottle on the counter. The label had Dr. Hales's name on it, but it wasn't one of Dad's usual prescriptions from the VA. The instructions said, take twice daily, but there was no note about why it had been prescribed. When Evelyn came in, I asked about it. She said Hales thought it would help Dad stay calm. I've heard that line before. In the field, I've seen meds used to make people compliant enough to sign things they wouldn't otherwise agree to. I didn't accuse her outright, but I took a photo of the bottle and tucked it back exactly where I found it. The rest of the afternoon, Evelyn acted like nothing unusual had happened. She made Dad tea, put on some music he liked, and even offered to cook dinner. But I kept replaying the exam in my head. She'd set it up, she'd sat in on it, and she'd walked out with exactly what she wanted, an official-sounding recommendation that Dad couldn't manage his own affairs. That night, I called Sophie Keller. We'd served in the same unit years ago, before she left the Army to work at the VA hospital. I told her what happened, down to the questions Hales asked and the way Evelyn hovered. Sophie didn't hesitate. Bring him to me. We'll run a full cognitive panel here. If he's still sharp, it'll show, but you need to do it without her knowing. I agreed. The less Evelyn knew, the better. Dad was still sitting in his recliner, watching some old Western, when I hung up. He looked tired, but not confused, not incapable, and certainly not ready to hand his life over to someone who saw him as an obstacle instead of family. I poured myself a glass of water and stood by the window. Out near the gate, headlights slowed, then moved on. Maybe it was nothing, but if I'd learned one thing in the military, it's that you never assume nothing when you've already spotted the pattern. The next morning I told Evelyn I was taking Dad out for breakfast. She didn't ask where, which was exactly what I wanted. We loaded into my truck instead of her SUV and headed toward town, but halfway there, I turned south toward the VA hospital. Dad didn't question it until we pulled into the parking lot. Thought you might like a second opinion, I said as I helped him out of the truck, from someone who doesn't have wine glasses and contracts in her office. Inside, Sophie met us in the lobby. She still had that no-nonsense energy from her Army days, and the kind of handshake that tells you she's got your back. She gave Dad a warm smile and led us to a private exam room. The testing wasn't rushed. Sophie went through each step, methodically short-term memory, long-term recall, problem solving. She gave him word lists to remember, asked him to explain a set of instructions, and even had him copy a drawing. Dad made jokes halfway through, but he followed every prompt. I could see him relax as the questions came. None of them were designed to trip him up. Halfway through, Sophie paused to check his vitals. She noticed the pill bottle I'd brought in a sealed bag. "This is interesting," she said, turning it in her hand. "This isn't on his VA chart. Do you know why he's taking it?" I told her Evelyn said it was to keep him calm. Sophie raised an eyebrow. "That's a sedative. At this dose, it can cloud thinking. If he took one before the last exam, that would explain a lot." By the end of the evaluation, Sophie was smiling. "Julia, your dad's got mild age-related memory decline, nothing outside the norm. He's still capable of making his own decisions. I'm putting that in the official report, and I'm logging this medication concern with the VA pharmacy department." We walked out with a printed summary and the full results sealed in an envelope. I slipped the envelope into my bag and made sure Dad didn't have to carry a thing. On the drive back, Dad was quiet for a while, then said, "Your mother would have liked her. That one's straight." I smiled but kept my eyes on the road. I didn't want to say too much about why we'd really gone. When we pulled into the driveway, Evelyn's SUV was already there. She came out of the house holding a clipboard and a smile that was more teeth than warmth. "Where've you two been?" she asked. "Breakfast," I said, holding up a to-go bag I'd picked up on the way back. She glanced at it, then at Dad, like she was trying to read something between us. The rest of the day, I kept things normal. Fed the chickens, cleaned the kitchen, sat with Dad while he watched the news. But I kept that VA envelope close. It wasn't time to show it yet, not until I had everything lined up. That evening, I checked the barn cameras I'd installed last month under the excuse of keeping raccoons out. One clip caught Evelyn walking with Colin along the fence line, pointing toward the old oak tree at the far boundary. They were with another man in a suit, and Colin was holding a folder. The video didn't have audio, but I didn't need it. Later, I found Evelyn in Dad's office again, flipping through the desk drawers, looking for the property tax statement. She said without turning around. I didn't argue. I just noted which drawer she'd opened, the one where Dad kept his bank statements. After she left, I went straight to that drawer. The statements were there, but I noticed one envelope was missing. I checked the others. Dates skipped. I pulled up Dad's online account on my laptop and scrolled through recent transactions. That's when I saw it. A $40,000 wire transfer to an LLC I didn't recognize. The memo line said, "Consulting fee." I took a screenshot and saved it with the camera footage and Sophie's report. The Army taught me to build a case like you're briefing a commander. You don't just show up with one piece of intel, you bring the full package so no one can poke holes in it. Downstairs, I heard Dad laughing at some joke on television. Evelyn was in the kitchen, on the phone again, her voice low but urgent. I didn't care what she was saying. I already knew I was getting close to having more than enough to put an end to this. And once I had it all, there wouldn't be any friendly toasts or polite clapping left to hide behind. I waited until the house was quiet before opening my laptop again. The $40,000 transfer stared back at me like it was written in red ink. The recipient LLC had a bland, forgettable name, something you'd scroll past without noticing. But a quick search pulled up its business registration. The listed address? A small office in Richmond. The registered agent? Colin Brooks, my charming brother-in-law. The memo line "consulting fee" made even less sense. Dad didn't hire consultants. His idea of professional advice was asking Roy Turner down the road which feed brand was on sale that week. I scrolled further through the statements. 2 smaller transfers, each just under $10,000, had gone to the same LLC over the past 4 months. That's not pocket change, and it wasn't farm-related. I printed the pages and added them to the growing file in my bag. The next morning, I made breakfast for Dad and told him I needed to run into town. Instead, I drove to the county records office. I'd worn my Army jacket not for show, but because I knew people tend to answer your questions faster when they think you've spent time in uniform. The clerk on duty didn't recognize me, but she did recognize the name Merrick and was polite enough to pull up recent filings. Nothing had been recorded yet for a sale of our farm, but there was an open file labeled Pre-Contract Title Review. The requester? Collins LLC. The clerk slid the paper back into the folder before I could read more, but I'd already seen enough to know they weren't just talking, they were moving. When I got home, Evelyn's car was in the driveway again. She was in the kitchen with Dad, smiling like she hadn't just been caught transferring his money into her husband's business. I sat down at the table and poured myself coffee. "How's business in Richmond?" I asked. She didn't look up from buttering toast. "Busy, as always." "Why?" "Just curious if the consulting gig's working out." That made her pause. She glanced at me, eyes sharp. "What are you talking about?" $40,000 to an LLC registered to Colin, I said casually. 2 smaller payments before that. All from Dad's account. Evelyn put down the knife. "Dad asked for help. We're helping. That money's going toward his future care." "Funny," I said, "because Sophie at the VA says he's fine, capable, doesn't need anyone making decisions for him." Her expression tightened. "Julia, you've been home 5 minutes and you think you know everything. You don't see what I see. Dad's not the same." I let her talk, but I kept my eyes on her. In the army, you learn when to push and when to let someone keep digging their own hole. After she left, Dad looked at me and frowned. "She says I agreed to those payments." "I don't remember, but maybe I did?" I pulled the VA report from my bag and handed it to him. "You didn't agree to this, Dad, and even if you had, you were taking medication you didn't need at the time. That's not consent." He read the summary slowly, then set it down. "Your mom always said Evelyn could talk a dog off a meat truck. Guess she's still got it." That afternoon, I drove out to see Roy and Martha Turner. They'd known Dad since before I was born and had a knack for keeping track of what went on in the county. Roy poured me coffee, and Martha sat down across from me. "You know Colin's been showing people the property, right?" she said before I even asked. Roy nodded. "Saw him here twice last week with some fella in a suit. They walked the fence line, took pictures. Didn't see Evelyn, though." Martha got up and came back with an envelope. Inside were 3 photos, Colin and the suited man near the gate, then by the barn, then pointing toward the pasture. "Snapped them from the kitchen window," she said. "Didn't figure they'd want me asking questions." I thanked them and added the photos to my file. Between the bank transfers, the title review, the VA report, and now the photos, the pattern was no longer just in my head. It was on paper, and it was solid. Back at the farm, Dad was sitting on the porch, watching the sunset. I handed him his jacket and sat beside him. He didn't say much, but I could tell he was thinking. I didn't press. Some conversations work better when the other person starts them. Evelyn's car pulled in as the sky turned orange. She got out with a grocery bag, waved like nothing was wrong, and went inside without waiting for a response. I watched her go, my mind already working through the next move. I wasn't ready to play every card yet, but the deck was getting stacked in my favor. The photos from the Turners were still on my passenger seat when I pulled back into our driveway. I didn't take them inside right away. I liked keeping them close, like carrying extra ammo. Evelyn's car was gone, which made the place feel lighter. Dad was in the living room with the television low, the way he liked it in the evenings. I sat with him for a while before steering the conversation toward the Turners. "Martha says you and Roy used to help each other at harvest time," I said. He chuckled. "Roy's been running that combine since before I could grow a beard. We'd swap labor his hay, my corn. Never once had to sign a contract. How one? That was the kind of trust Evelyn was trying to cash in on now. And I knew if the Turners were paying attention, others in the area might be too." The next morning, I drove back over to their place, this time without any pretense. Martha had coffee ready before I even knocked. "I've been thinking about what we saw," she said, sliding the photos across the table again. "It's not just Colin. There's a woman with them, sometimes tall, dark hair, big sunglasses. Don't know her name." "Lend." Roy leaned back in his chair. "They're acting like they already own the place. Measured the front field last week, right down to the ditch line. And they weren't shy about being seen." That detail stuck with me. In the military, if someone doesn't care that you see them, it's either arrogance or they think you can't stop them. Martha went to the other room and came back with a shoebox of old photographs. She pulled out a faded shot of me and Evelyn as kids, playing in the hayloft. "Your mom used to say that barn was the heart of this place," she said. "Be a shame if someone ripped it down to build vacation rentals." We talked for another hour, half about the past, and half about what might be coming. They didn't have proof beyond the photos, but their instincts lined up with mine. When I left, Martha hugged me and whispered, "Don't let them take it." On the way home, I passed the old feed store. The sign was sun-faded, but the lot was full of trucks. I spotted a familiar face, Frank Johnson, who'd done repair work on our tractors for years. I pulled in. "Julia Merrick," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Back from the army, huh?" "On leave," I said. "You heard anything about my place?" He nodded slowly. "Just chatter. Word is somebody from Richmond sniffing around talking about redevelopment potential. Not hard to figure out who's feeding that line." That was enough for me. I'd been building a file of hard evidence, but local rumor has its own weight in small towns. If people believed the farm was already on the chopping block, that could make it easier for Evelyn to close her deal. When I got back, Dad was sitting at the kitchen table with a worn photo album open. He'd been looking at pictures from the year Mom planted the oak tree out front. "She said it'd be here long after we were gone," he said, tapping the photo. I sat down across from him. "It still can be, Dad, but we have to be smart about this." He nodded, not asking for details, which I appreciated. I didn't want him involved in the parts that were about to get ugly. That evening, I took the long way back from the mailbox, walking past the barn and along the fence line. The grass was still pressed down in places where people had walked recently. 3 sets of tracks, maybe 4. Near the gate, I found a small orange surveyor's flag stuck in the ground. I pulled it out and slipped it into my pocket. Inside, I added it to the folder with the photos, bank records, and VA report. Every piece told the same story. Evelyn and Colin weren't circling, they were moving in. Dad called from the living room, asking if I wanted to watch an old John Wayne movie with him. I told him I'd be right there, closing the folder and setting it on the counter. It wasn't just a file anymore. It was a plan taking shape, one that had no room for mistakes. The next morning, I stood at the kitchen counter with my phone in hand, staring at Daniel Cross's name. We'd served together on a deployment years ago, and now he was a major in the Judge Advocate General's Corps. I hit dial. He picked up on the second ring. "Captain Merrick, I take it this isn't a social call." "Not unless you consider elder financial abuse small talk," I said. I laid out the situation: Hales's questionable exam, the sedatives, the bank transfers, the title review, and the local sightings of Colin with potential buyers. Daniel didn't interrupt, just let me run through the facts like I was delivering an ops briefing. When I finished, he said, "You've got more than suspicion. You've got a paper trail. I can help you draft a military power of attorney for your dad broad enough to override any other POA that wasn't properly executed. You'll need his signature and a notary. I'll send you the template." I wrote it all down while he talked. "If Evelyn tries to push her POA through based on Hales's exam, you'll have grounds to challenge it immediately," he added. "And if you can prove undue influence or chemical impairment, it gets stronger." By noon, the email from him came through with the form and instructions. I printed it, double-checked every clause, and tucked it into the folder. After lunch, I took Dad into town under the pretext of picking up more chicken feed. On the way, I told him the truth, that I wanted to give him legal protection that Evelyn couldn't undo. He listened without interrupting. "Julia," he said finally, "I don't like all this fighting, but if you think it's necessary, I'll sign whatever keeps this place in the family." We stopped at a small law office I'd called ahead to. The notary was ready, and the process took less than 15 minutes. Dad signed with a steady hand, and I countersigned as his designated representative. The notary stamped the pages with a heavy thud that felt like closing a hatch. Walking out, Dad looked at me and said, "Your mother would have said you should have been a lawyer." "Too much paperwork," I said. On the drive back, I noticed Evelyn's SUV in the distance on a side road that cut toward the Turner property. She wasn't alone. Colin was in the passenger seat. They didn't see us, but it confirmed she wasn't wasting any time. That night, I called Daniel again. "We've got the military POA executed and notarized." "Good. Keep it secure. And Julia, don't tip your hand unless you have to. The element of surprise is worth more than any clause in that document." I agreed. Years in uniform had taught me that timing can turn a solid plan into a decisive win. I wanted Evelyn to think she still had the upper hand right up until the moment it all came apart. Before bed, I went through the file again. VA report, medication photo, bank statements, county records, neighbor photos, surveyor flag, and now the signed POA. Every piece was around in the magazine. I just needed the right target and the right moment. Down the hall, Dad's door was slightly open. I heard the low hum of his television and the occasional laugh. It was a reminder of why I was doing all this, not for the property itself, but for the man who had spent his whole life building it. I closed my laptop, slid the folder into the bottom drawer of my desk, and locked it. Then I shut off the kitchen light and stood for a moment in the dark, listening. The farmhouse was quiet, but not still. Somewhere outside, a car engine idled briefly, then faded away. I didn't bother looking through the window. Whoever it was would be back, and when they came, I'd be ready. I spotted Evelyn's SUV outside the little cafe on Main Street, and decided it was time to stop letting her think I was working in the dark. I parked across the street, walked in, and found her at a corner table with a latte and her phone. She glanced up, surprised, but recovered fast. "Julia," she said, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" I sat down without asking. "We need to talk about the 40 grand you siphoned out of Dad's account." "Zero." Her smile didn't falter, but her fingers tightened around the cup. "It wasn't siphoned. It was allocated for his care. Something you wouldn't understand since you've been away playing soldier." I leaned forward. "I understand exactly what you're doing. You're running a sale before the owner knows the property's on the market, and you're counting on a doctored medical evaluation to make it stick." Evelyn's voice dropped. "You're treading close to slander, Julia. And unlike you, I know how to handle a courtroom. I know how to handle evidence." I shot back. "And I've got plenty." She smirked. "Evidence doesn't mean anything if you don't know how to use it. Maybe you've forgotten you're not in charge here. Dad trusts me, the contracts are moving forward, and once it's done you can go back to Fort Bragg and play hero somewhere else." I could feel my jaw tightening, but I kept my tone even. "You might want to slow down before you trip over your own arrogance." She took a sip of her latte, then leaned in. "Let me make something clear. You're not going to win. You're up against people who know this game inside and out. I've got Colin, I've got Dr. Hales, and I've got a network that sees your uniform as a distraction, not a qualification. If you stay out of it, I might let you keep visiting the farm after it's sold." "Oh, one?" It was the kind of smug, calculated dig she'd been perfecting since we were kids. I stood up, tossed a 5 on the table, and said, "You just made my job easier. You've got the ego of someone who doesn't think they can lose. That's how people lose." I walked out before she could respond. Back in the truck, I sat for a moment, running through the exchange. Evelyn wasn't just confident, she was convinced she had enough leverage to make this airtight. That meant she was either bluffing hard or sitting on something I hadn't uncovered yet. Either way, the fact that she'd leaned into intimidation told me she was feeling the pressure. When I got home, Dad was on the porch with a blanket over his lap. "You look like you just stared down a drill sergeant," he said. "Something like that," I replied, handing him the coffee I'd picked up for him on the way. Inside, I updated my notes, adding every word from the cafe conversation. In the Army, you don't rely on memory for critical intel. You write it down, timestamp it, and keep it secure. That way, no one can twist it later. As I closed the folder, my phone buzzed with a text from Sophie. "Got something you'll want to see. Swing by when you can." The timing couldn't have been better. I grabbed my keys and headed for the VA hospital. Sophie was waiting in her office with a copy of Dad's pharmacy record from the last 6 months. "This," she said, pointing to one entry, "is the sedative Hales prescribed. Look at the date, it's the day before his cognitive test at her clinic. And here's the kicker. The dosage was higher than what's normally prescribed for sleep aid. This wasn't for rest. It was to impair." I took a photo of the record and thanked her. "This might be the nail in the coffin," I said. On the drive back, I thought about Evelyn's words at the cafe. She'd named her allies openly, Colin, Hales, and some vague network. If she felt untouchable, it was because she thought no one could connect the dots. She was wrong. When I got back to the farm, the sun was setting over the pasture, casting long shadows across the barn. Evelyn's SUV was parked by the gate, but she wasn't in sight. I didn't bother looking for her. I already knew where my focus needed to be, stacking the deck so high that when it all came crashing down, there wouldn't be anything left for her to hide behind. I was halfway through locking the barn when the security app on my phone pinged motion detected. The feed from the west camera showed Colin's truck idling near the gate. A man in a sport coat got out, clipboard in hand, while Colin pointed toward the barn. The camera caught the glow of their flashlights sweeping across the siding. I stayed in the shadows by the barn door, watching them on my phone until they turned back toward the truck. The third figure lagged behind a woman in dark jeans with her hood up, holding what looked like a measuring wheel. Not Evelyn, but clearly part of her crew. Once their taillights disappeared down the road, I went to the gate and found 2 more orange surveyor's flags tucked into the grass. They went into my pocket with the one I'd found earlier. Back inside, I uploaded the new footage to the same secure cloud I'd been using for everything. Never store all your intel in one physical location, not when you know the other side would happily lose it. The next morning, Sophie called. "Swing by the hospital. I've got something for you." When I got there, she handed me a sealed envelope. "These are the original VA medical files for your dad from his last 2 checkups. Not the summary, the full chart. Compare these to whatever Hales wrote up. You'll see the problem immediately." At home, I spread both sets of documents on the dining table. The VA chart showed stable vitals, normal cognitive testing scores, and 0 recommendation for guardianship or POA transfer. Hales's report, on the other hand, was a creative writing exercise. Phrases like "patient shows significant confusion" and "requires assistance with basic decisions," written in confident pen strokes. The kicker was the date on Hales's report. It matched exactly with the sedative prescription Sophie had flagged. I scanned and saved everything, then printed an extra set to stash in my truck. Years of logistics work had taught me redundancy is everything. Later that afternoon, I noticed Evelyn's SUV in the driveway again. She was inside with Dad, chatting like they were the only 2 people in the world. When she left, I checked the study. The desk drawers were closed, but the file cabinet key was still warm. Inside, the manila folder labeled "Farm Deed" had been moved forward. I took it out, flipped through, and found a photocopy of the deed with a sticky note in Evelyn's handwriting. "Review with JH before Friday." JH, another piece of the puzzle I didn't recognize yet. That evening, I sat with Dad on the porch. He was quiet, watching the tree line. "You think they'll come after it while I'm still here?" he asked suddenly. "I think they already are," I said. "But they're not getting it." He nodded like that was all he needed to hear. After he went inside, I walked back to the barn. The night was clear, no wind, every sound sharp. I could hear a car engine a half-mile off, moving slow. I turned off my flashlight and let my eyes adjust. When the headlights finally appeared, it was the same truck from earlier. This time, it didn't stop. It rolled past, but not before I saw the driver glance toward the house. I stood there until the sound faded, then checked the cameras again before heading in. All quiet. For now. In the kitchen, I opened the file folder one more time. The evidence pile was no longer just a safety net, it was leverage, enough to dismantle every piece of the operation Evelyn and Colin had put together. The only question left was when to use it, and as far as I was concerned, that answer was coming sooner than they thought. By the time Dad's birthday rolled around, the air in the house felt charged, like the minutes before a summer storm. Evelyn had taken it upon herself to coordinate the gathering, which meant a mix of family, a handful of Dad's old friends, and more than a few strangers I didn't recognize from anywhere in Lexington. I helped Dad into his best button-down, the one Mom bought him years ago for Sunday services. He seemed relaxed, but I knew him well enough to see the way his hands tapped against the armrest he was reading the room before he even stepped into it. Downstairs, Evelyn was directing 2 caterers, like she was staging a political fundraiser. The dining room table was covered with food, perfectly arranged, and the smell of roasted pork and apple pie drifted through the house. "Looks good," I said as I passed. She gave me that thin smile. "We want Dad's big day to be memorable. I'll play." The phrase landed heavier than she probably intended. Guests began arriving in small waves. The Turners came first, bringing a bottle of bourbon wrapped in a ribbon. Martha hugged me and whispered, "Keep your eyes open." Then came a retired Army buddy of Dad's named Mike, whose handshake was still as solid as it had been 20 years ago. Then came the strangers' well-dressed couples who smiled politely but had the air of people scoping out a property rather than celebrating a birthday. One man shook Dad's hand and complimented the quaint, undeveloped acreage. I filed his face away instantly. Evelyn floated from guest to guest, laughing a little too loudly at jokes, keeping Colin close at her side. He wore the confident grin of someone who believed he was minutes away from sealing a deal. I stayed near Dad, keeping the conversation light. We talked about his old tractors, the oak tree, even a fishing trip he'd taken decades ago. But every so often I caught Evelyn glancing our way, her eyes calculating. Halfway through the afternoon, she tapped a glass with a spoon. Can I have everyone's attention? She said, her voice cutting through the chatter. The room quieted. Dad looked at me, puzzled. First, she began, I want to thank everyone for coming to celebrate Dad's 72nd birthday. He's had an incredible life here on the farm, but as we all know, seasons change. And with change comes the opportunity to ensure he's cared for the way he deserves. My chest tightened. Evelyn continued, That's why Colin and I are excited to share that the farm will soon be in the hands of new owners who will preserve its charm while giving Dad the financial security to live comfortably in a wonderful care facility in Richmond. A ripple of murmurs passed through the room. Dad's jaw dropped slightly. And, she added with a falsely gentle smile, we'll also be making some adjustments at home to prepare for the transition. Julia, I think it's best you start making arrangements to head back to base sooner rather than later. The new owners will want the place cleared. The words hit like a hammer, but I kept my expression neutral. Years in uniform had taught me how to hold the line under pressure. Dad's voice cut through the murmurs. Evelyn, what the hell are you talking about? She put a hand on his shoulder, her tone syrupy. Dad, it's all for your benefit. You don't need the burden of this place anymore. Julia understands. I met her gaze and held it, saying nothing yet. The room felt like it had tilted slightly, the tension crackling between every guest. Somewhere behind me, Martha whispered to Roy, and I saw Mike fold his arms, watching closely. Colin stepped forward, ready to smooth things over. It's a positive change, Tom. We've found buyers who appreciate the history here. It's going to be a win for everyone. Dad's eyes darted to me, searching for an anchor. I gave the smallest nod, just enough to tell him I wasn't going anywhere. Evelyn raised her glass. To new beginnings? Some guests lifted their drinks, others hesitated. I didn't touch mine. Not yet. Instead, I laid a hand lightly on Dad's arm and smiled for the crowd, the way you do before making your move in a high-stakes game. Every piece I'd gathered, the VA report, the bank transfers, the photos, the POA, was ready. All I had to do was decide when to put them on the table. And judging by the way Evelyn's eyes sparkled with premature victory, that moment was coming fast. I stayed seated just long enough for Evelyn to believe she'd won. Then I stood, sliding my chair back slow enough to draw every eye in the room. My voice was calm, but it carried. Before we start packing boxes for this wonderful care facility, I think Dad and everyone here should hear a few things. Evelyn's smile stiffened. Julia, this isn't the time. It's exactly the time, I cut in. Because the only reason you're announcing this today is you think no one can stop you. That ends right now. And I pulled a folder from my bag and laid the first document on the table. This is a VA medical evaluation, done by Nurse Sophie Keller. It says Dad is perfectly capable of making his own decisions. No dementia, no loss of capacity, fit to manage his own affairs. Sophie, standing near the doorway, stepped forward. That's correct. I ran every test myself. He passed them all, and I can also confirm that the exam doctor, Hale's use to justify a POA transfer was done under the influence of an unnecessary sedative. Gasps rippled through the guests. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. That's absurd. I dropped the next set of papers on the table. Bank statements. 3 transfers from Dad's account to an LLC registered to Colin Brooks. $40,000 total. The memo lines say, consulting fee. Consulting for what exactly? Colin's jaw tightened. You're twisting. No, I'm documenting, I said, sliding the county records forward. Title review request filed by that same LLC, naming our farm. That's not protecting Dad, that's prepping a sale without his consent. Roy Turner cleared his throat. I saw Colin showing strangers around the property. Got photos. He held them up and Martha nodded beside him. Evelyn's voice was sharper now. You have no authority. I pulled the final document from my folder and held it up. Military power of attorney, signed by Dad, notarized and legally recognized under federal and state law. It voids any previous POA that wasn't executed properly, and yours wasn't, because it was based on a fraudulent medical report. Daniel Cross stepped forward from the back of the room, his uniform crisp. I've reviewed it. It's valid. Any transfer of property or funds under the previous POA is now subject to investigation. And given the evidence, Adult Protective Services will likely get involved. The silence was heavy now, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator. Evelyn's gaze darted between me, Daniel, and the growing number of guests staring at her. Dad stood, steady despite the tension. I'm not selling my farm. I didn't ask for my money to be moved. And I damn sure didn't ask for anyone to decide where I live. Evelyn reached for his arm. Dad, you don't understand. He pulled back. I understand just fine. You're done making decisions for me. Sophie placed a small recorder on the table. For the record, this conversation is being documented. Anything said here can be included in the report to APS and the State Bar Association. Evelyn's face flushed. Colin muttered something under his breath, but Daniel's presence kept him from stepping forward. Around the room, people shifted uncomfortably. Some of the strangers began edging toward the door, clearly realizing they'd walked into the wrong kind of party. I looked Evelyn dead in the eye. You thought you could run this like a business deal, but this is family, and I don't fold under pressure. For the first time all afternoon, she didn't have a comeback. Just a thin, brittle silence. Dad sat back down, and I stood beside him, my hand resting on the back of his chair. The room was still full of food, music playing faintly in the background, but the atmosphere had shifted completely. The people who mattered knew the truth now, and the ones who didn't matter were already finding the door. I took a slow breath, the kind you take when you know the worst is out in the open. The game Evelyn had been running wasn't just stalled, it was over. She just hadn't figured that part out yet. Evelyn's composure cracked first in her voice. You think you can humiliate me in my own father's house? She said, the pitch rising. This is Dad's house, I corrected. And if you feel humiliated, that's because the truth doesn't look good on you. Colin stepped closer, his jaw set, but Daniel shifted just enough to block his path. The unspoken message was clear. Try it, and you'll regret it. Martha folded her arms. We all know Tom's not the type to give away his land. Not to strangers, and sure as hell not to someone sneaking around with survey flags. Roy added, I've worked this ground with Tom. That farm is him. You take it away. You take away the man. Ain't right. The murmurs in the room swelled again, this time against Evelyn. One of the well-dressed strangers whispered something to her and slipped toward the door, followed by another couple. The party she had built to cement her authority was unraveling in real time. Sophie kept her eyes on Evelyn. The sedatives you arranged for Dr. Hales to prescribe, that's criminal when it's used to impair someone's legal capacity. And I've already sent the pharmacy record to the state medical board. Evelyn's head snapped toward her. You have no right. I have every right to report a violation of medical ethics, Sophie said evenly. And you might want to call Hales and let her know she's about to get a visit from an investigator. Colin muttered something I didn't catch, but I caught his expression calculating the exit strategy. Evelyn, though, was too deep in the moment to see the walls closing in. Dad's voice cut through again. I trusted you, Evelyn. Your mother would have been sick to see this. For a second, I thought I saw a flicker of shame cross her face, but it was gone almost instantly, replaced with cold defiance. Everything I did was for your own good. No, I said, stepping forward. Everything you did was for control. And you lost it the moment Dad signed the military POA. Every dollar you moved, every meeting you set up without his consent, it's all going to be looked at. And not just by me. Daniel glanced at me before speaking. Captain Merrick isn't bluffing. As of this moment, I'll be notifying APS and the Commonwealth's attorney. You might want to get your own lawyer before you speak another word. The last of the strangers slipped out the front door. All that remained were Dad's friends, neighbors, and a few distant relatives, who clearly wanted no part in siding with Evelyn now. She turned to Dad one more time, her voice low. You'll regret this. He shook his head. I regret that I didn't see through it sooner. Colin tugged at her arm. Let's go. But Evelyn wasn't ready to leave without the last word. This farm is a liability. It's falling apart, and so are you. Julia's just delaying the inevitable. 1. Dad leaned back in his chair, calm now in a way that made her words slide right off him. I've been called stubborn my whole life. Guess I'll add you to the list of people who couldn't change that. Evelyn's breathing was sharp, her hands clenched so tight the knuckles blanched. She looked around the room and saw nothing but closed faces. Even the ones who hadn't spoken had already judged her. Colin finally pulled her toward the door. She didn't resist this time, but as she crossed the threshold, she looked back at me. The glare she gave could have cut steel, but I didn't flinch. I'd stared down worse in places a lot less forgiving than this. The door shut behind them, and the hum of conversation returned slowly, cautiously. Martha came over, patted Dad's shoulder, and said, "We'll keep an eye out for any more visitors who don't belong." Roy nodded in agreement. "They won't get within 100 yards without someone knowing." I thanked them, my voice steady, even though my pulse was still hammering from the confrontation. Across the room, Daniel gave me a small nod, part approval, part confirmation that the next steps were already in motion. Dad poured himself a glass of bourbon from the bottle the Turners brought and held it up toward me. "To holding the line," he said. I raised my glass of water to match his. The storm had broken, and though the cleanup wasn't over, the ground we stood on was still ours. And I planned to keep it that way. Dad's toast was still hanging in the air when the sound of Evelyn's SUV tearing down the gravel driveway broke through the chatter. A couple of guests glanced toward the window, but no one moved to follow. The people who mattered were still here, and that was enough. Mike, Dad's old army buddy, came over and clapped me on the shoulder. "You handled that like a CO on inspection day. Kept your head while the rest of us were ready to start flipping tables." I've learned a thing or two about keeping order," I said with a half smile. Daniel excused himself to make a few calls on the porch, phone pressed tight to his ear. Sophie began gathering her documents, already labeling envelopes for APS and the medical board. The Turners stayed close to Dad, chatting about the old days, keeping the atmosphere light enough that he wouldn't dwell too much on the betrayal that had just unfolded. But Dad wasn't in the dark. I caught him watching the doorway, his jaw set. When I asked if he was all right, he nodded slowly. "I'm fine, Julia. Just angry I let it get this far. I should have trusted my gut months ago. Trusting family isn't a flaw, Dad. It's what makes you who you are," I told him. "They're the ones who broke that trust, not you." Martha came over with a slice of pie for him, insisting he eat something before the bourbon got ahead of him. Roy joined in, telling a story about the time Dad tried to fix a hay baler with nothing but duct tape and stubbornness. Laughter rippled through the room, cutting the tension. Outside, Daniel returned, sliding his phone into his pocket. "APS is dispatching an investigator this week. The Commonwealth's attorney wants to review the bank records and the medical evidence, and I've already sent the POA to the county clerk to make it official in their system." Dad let out a long breath. "Feels good to know it's not just us keeping watch." The mood lifted after that. The music came back up, people drifted toward the food, and the smell of pie and coffee replaced the metallic edge of confrontation. Even so, I noticed the guests were sticking close to Dad, like they were circling wagons around him. An hour later, most of the crowd began filtering out. Hugs were exchanged, promises to stop by more often made, and every one of them left, knowing exactly where things stood with the Merrick farm. Word would travel fast in Lexington. When the last neighbor's truck pulled away, the house fell quiet again. Dad, Daniel, Sophie, and I stayed at the table, the remains of the feast scattered between us. "That was the easy part," Daniel said. "Now we make sure the follow-through sticks. Evelyn and Colin will try to spin this. Don't be surprised if they claim you manipulated your dad." I smirked. "They can try. I've got every piece of evidence triple-backed and time-stamped, and they made the mistake of underestimating just how many people are willing to vouch for Dad's competence." Sophie slid the pharmacy record across the table toward me. "Keep this close. It's the kind of thing that makes prosecutors sit up straight." I tucked it into the folder without looking, already knowing its value. "They wanted to write their own version of the story," I said. "Now they're stuck with mine, and mine's got witnesses." Dad pushed back from the table. "Julia, I don't say this enough, but I'm proud of you. You fought for me the way I used to fight to keep this place running. That's because you taught me how," I said. We cleared the table together. The normal rhythm of farm life, dishes clinking, coffee brewing, was starting to settle back in, even if the day had been anything but ordinary. When night finally fell, I stepped out onto the porch alone. The crickets were loud, the air still warm. Out past the fence line, the pasture stretched dark and quiet. It looked exactly the same as it had that morning, but it felt different now, secured. From inside, I heard Dad laughing at something Sophie said, his voice full and unstrained. That was worth more than any piece of paper in my folder. I stayed there a while, letting the calm sink in. Whatever came next, the worst of the fight had already been won, and we were still standing on our own ground. The frost on the grass crunched under my boots as I walked toward the barn, the early winter sun just peeking over the hills. 3 months had passed since Evelyn's party imploded, and the farm had settled into a steady rhythm again, morning chores, repairs, and the kind of quiet that lets you hear yourself think. Dad was sitting on the porch in his coat and cap, a mug of coffee steaming in his hands. "You're up early, Captain," he said with a grin. "Old habits," I replied, handing him the mail. Most of it was junk, but one envelope carried the letterhead of the Virginia Department of Health Professions. He opened it, read silently, and handed it over. The letter confirmed Dr. Hales's license was suspended pending a full investigation. Sophie had been right, using sedatives to impair a patient's legal capacity wasn't something the board took lightly. Next came the letter from the Commonwealth's Attorney's Office. Evelyn and Colin were under formal investigation for financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. No charges yet, but the language was clear. They were not walking away clean. Dad set both letters aside without gloating. "I just want them to leave us alone," he said. "They will," I told him. "They've already lost the one thing they wanted." Inside, the phone rang. It was Daniel. "Got confirmation. APS closed their file on your dad. They're satisfied he's safe and in good hands. I'll send you the final documentation for your records." "Appreciate it, Major," I said. "Drinks are on me next time you're in town." After breakfast, I walked the fence line with the old farm dog trailing behind. The oak tree in the back pasture was bare now, its limbs stretching into the pale sky. The land looked stark in winter, but it was still ours. That mattered more than anything. A new caretaker had started last week, Rick, a retired Army mechanic who knew his way around a hay baler better than anyone I'd met. He worked mornings and evenings, giving Dad the help he needed without taking away his independence. As we passed the shed, Rick waved from the tractor. "She's running smoother than she has in years," he called. Dad leaned on the fence, watching. "That machine's older than you are," he said. "And still worth keeping," I replied. By afternoon, the sun had warmed enough for Dad to join me in the garden. We trimmed the last of the dried stalks and mulched the beds for spring. It wasn't just maintenance, it was a way of saying we planned to be here for another season and the one after that. When the mail came again, there was a small postcard from Martha and Roy. On the front was a photo of the old grain mill in town, and on the back, in Roy's blunt handwriting, "Still keeping watch. No one's been near your place without us knowing." Dad chuckled. "We've got better security than Fort Knox." As the day wound down, we sat on the porch again. The sky turned from gold to deep blue, and the first stars came out. The quiet between us wasn't heavy anymore. It was the kind of silence that feels like home. "I know you'll be heading back to base soon," Dad said, breaking the stillness. "But I'm glad you were here when you were. I couldn't have done this alone." "You didn't have to," I told him. "That's what family's supposed to be when it's done right." He nodded, sipping his coffee, his eyes on the dark line of trees at the edge of the field. "Your mom would have liked seeing it turn out this way." End of 2. "I think she would have liked watching me put Evelyn in her place too," I said, earning a laugh from him. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. Somewhere out there, Evelyn and Colin were probably figuring out how to rebuild their reputations. That was their problem. Ours was keeping this farm running, and that was a fight I didn't mind taking on. Before heading inside, I took one last look across the pasture. The land wasn't just dirt and grass, it was history, stubbornness, and a promise kept. And for the first time in months, it felt like the future here was finally safe. Standing there on the porch that night, I realized the fight with Evelyn had never been just about land or money. It was about making sure my dad kept the life he built, and that no one family or not could take it from him. The Army taught me how to lead, but this taught me why you lead, to protect what matters, even when it's messy, personal, and close to the bone. We didn't just save the farm, we saved the piece of ourselves that calls it home. And that, more than any victory I've had in uniform, is the one I'll carry with me.